Okay, everybody, today we're going to be talking about organizing your speeches. I'm going to be referring a lot in this presentation to material from chapter 9 of your textbook, so it would be a good idea to review that ahead of time or follow along while you are watching this presentation. When we start talking about organization, we're going to start at the very beginning. I'm told that's a very good place to start. And we're going to talk about the introduction to your speech. The introduction to your speech is going to follow basically the same format that introductions have been following in the papers that you've been writing in your English classes for years. But it's really important in a speech to start with a good introduction to get your audience hooked from the beginning. So the parts of the introduction and every intro to every speech you give this year is going to need to include these basic parts and will be graded on whether or not it has them. An attention getter, a link, a thesis, and a preview statement. So that's a pretty easy checklist to look at there to make sure that your introduction has all those parts. Let's break each of those parts down a little bit and talk about them in more detail. Attention getters. Again, you've been using attention getters in papers in your English classes for years now. And all those same attention getters that you use in papers in English classes will work well for your speeches. So thinking about asking a question. Now, asking a question is okay. A lot of people start doing attention getters that are question attention getters and then move on to more sophisticated ones because sometimes asking a question can sound a little cliche. A good test of whether or not you should ask a question as your attention getter: are you actually anticipating an answer of some kind? If you're not, then there's probably something better that you could do. Make a reference to the occasion or situation. So you can talk about the fact that you're here giving a speech, that you're giving a demonstration speech in speech class, for example, or something like that. Make a startling statement. Shock the audience and get their attention. This, of course, will be stronger if you have a citation for it and can prove where you got the information. Using a quotation, again, sometimes can be a cliche, sometimes can be very effective. Think about the speech, think about the quotation. One that I will steer you away from is using a dictionary definition as your attention getter. Most of the time when students use dictionary definitions, it's to words that we all already know the definition of. So those usually don't work very well. Telling a story. Usually in speech class we use the word anecdote. A short story, maybe a few sentences long. Stories can be really effective attention getters. The only problem is when they run on longer than the body of the speech. And I'm sure you're familiar with many others. Again, anything that you've used in an English class will usually work well as an attention getter for your speech. The next part that we're going to talk about is the link. And the link is the part that you are maybe least familiar with, but is often most important. The role of your link is to connect your attention getter to your thesis. So the attention getter is usually something fun, right? Something clever. And then when we go to the thesis, what we're actually talking about, sometimes there's an awkward moment where those two things don't really line up. So make sure you have a linking statement that starts out by talking about whatever was in your attention getter and ends up talking about your thesis. Without a link, the attention getter just seems awkward. It doesn't seem effective. Your thesis statement. This is the most important part of the entire speech. Every speech you give this year needs to have a strong thesis statement. Tell us what you are going to prove. In one sentence, tell us what it's going to take you the entire speech to say. So if instead of saying you have 6 to 8 minutes to do a demonstration speech, I said you have one sentence, what would you say in that one sentence that could come close to replacing the speech? Thesis statements need to be complete thoughts that can stand on their own. What I mean by that is if we take your thesis statement out of the speech and put it on a bumper sticker, it would make sense. A lot of the times we'll get bad thesis statements that say things like, there are 3 things to remember when you are changing the tire on your car. But they don't tell us what those 3 things are, and as a result, they're less effective. So the link is a little confusing. Let's take a look at some examples of attention getters that are linked well to thesis statements. Let's say I'm giving a speech about F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which is a really good book, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And I start with my attention getter. How many of you here today like to read books? The best book of all time is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is not a good introduction. We have an attention getter, right? How many of you like to read books? And we have a thesis. The best book of all time is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, but they're not linked. Let's break it down this way instead. Attention getter. How many of you here like to read books? Here's my link. Wow, that's a lot of you. You probably all have your own individual favorite book, but there's one book that everyone should admit is the best book of all time. Or, really? So few? Maybe that's because you've never read the best book of all time. Now I'm ready for my thesis. The best book of all time is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Notice here I ask a question as my attention getter. And I'm prepared for some kind of audience response. I have two different links ready depending on what the response is that I get. And in both situations, the link bridges between my attention getter and my thesis. The last part of your introduction is your preview statement. This is the one thing that you've probably been taught not to do in your composition classes. But speech is different than composition for a few key reasons I'm about to explain. In your preview statement, you tell us how you're going to prove your thesis. You're going to include at the end of your introduction a sentence or two that sounds something like, in this speech, I will, and then you're going to list several of the main points you're going to make in your speech. That's what's really different than in an essay. In an essay, you're taught not to say things like, in this paper, I'm going to tell you why The Great Gatsby is such a good book. But the difference is if I'm reading an essay that you've written, I have as many opportunities as I want to reread it, and I can slow down my reading if I'm having trouble following it. But when I'm listening to your speech, I only get one shot to hear it. So you're going to do a lot of what we call signposting. When you tell the audience, hey, by the way, here's what my next point is going to be. My previous point was this. Now here's my next one. And the first and most important signpost you put in is this preview statement. While we're on the subject of preview statements, let's talk about different organizational patterns. There are 5 different organizational patterns that we'll use this semester. The most basic one is chronological. When we do the demonstration speech, most of your speeches will be in chronological order. They move in order of time. This happens, then this other thing happens. That's why we start with a demonstration speech, because it's easy to organize. They're all going to be set up in chronological order. When you gave your intro speeches, a lot of you used climactic order. In climactic order, we start with the least important point and build to the most important one. Some of you might give demonstration speeches that follow spatial order. And I'm sick right now while I'm recording this. But some of you might give demonstration speeches that use spatial order, where you arrange things in order of where they are in physical space. Well, let's say I'm giving a demonstration speech on how to get around Fishers High School. I might talk about what's on the first floor, what's next to the cafeteria, where's the main office, what's on the second floor, what's on the north side of the building, the south side, the east side, and yes, the west side. In that case, I'm following spatial order. Later in the semester, when we do our persuasive speeches, we will get into these other 2 patterns, problem solution and cause and effect, but we won't use them right now at the beginning of the semester. Let's talk briefly about rules for outlines, and if you don't look at anything else in the chapter, I'm going to strongly encourage you to look at this section. On page 221 in your textbook, you have an example outline. That's the format I expect you to follow with all of your outlines for your speeches this semester. Up at the top of your outline, you're going to include a purpose statement that says the purpose of this speech is to teach people how to change a tire or inform people about why The Great Gatsby is the best book of all time. Your purpose statement should be specific, so not just general ideas, try to name your audience specifically, which I didn't do in those two example ones I just rattled off, but you can do better. Now, here's the most important part about purpose statements. They're up there to help you organize your thoughts. Don't read them to the audience as the very first thing in your speech. Start your speech with your attention getter. Your outline should reflect a separate introduction, body, and conclusion. And again, it's easy to see how to format that if you look at page 221. Your outline should include subordination, which is a complicated word for a kind of straightforward idea. What subordination means is you have big major ideas that you then subdivide into smaller ideas. So your demonstration speech is probably going to have a section called Getting Started, and then you break that down into gathering supplies, getting set up, cleaning off the area you're going to be using for whatever it is that you're doing. Right? That's where you use like the big Roman numerals for your large ideas and break them down into smaller points. So yeah, what are your most important ideas, and then what is subordinate to them? When you're using subordination, every A needs a B, every one needs a 2, etc. If you only have an A, then you're not doing any subdividing, and you should just back that up to the previous point in your outline. Anytime you go from a big letter to a smaller one, you're dividing, and there's no point in dividing things into one part. When you do your outline, please write them as sentence fragments, as notes. Outlines should not read like essays. Do not write long, complete sentences and paragraphs. I will take points off from them. The whole idea is to be able to look up from your outline and engage with your audience as you speak. Transitions. Apparently, I didn't animate this slide. As you move through that outline, make sure you are illustrating the relationship between 2 points. Why is point B in between points A and C? So whenever you move through a major division, start your next section by talking about the previous section and end by talking about the following one. Remember to signpost. In speeches, you're encouraged to say things like, and now my next point is... Easy transition words to use with your chronological order, like for your demonstration speech, we're going to hear things like first, second, next, last. For your spatial speech, in front, behind, left, right. If you're following climactic, we're going to hear things like however, not only, also, even though. So use good transitions. And the last thing we're going to talk about is your conclusion. I think I mentioned in class that when students are nervous about presenting, the part of the speech they often bail out on is the conclusion, but it's the last thing you're leaving your audience with. You want to end strong. And the conclusion is going to be easy to write because it's going to look like the introduction, but upside down. Start by reviewing the points that you made. Take us back through that preview statement. You're going to say something like, so today we talked about X, Y, and Z. Then restate the thesis, and then close with a clincher. Your clincher should sound a lot like your attention getter. If you start out by telling a story about yourself, your clincher at the end is going to be, so the next time you're in a situation like the one I was in, now you'll know how to change your tire, or read The Great Gatsby, or what have you.